Hello and welcome back again. In this third section of our presentation, I want to talk about some of the problems with nationalism, the reasons that nationalism tends to run into problems when we try to use it as an explanatory factor for actually existing facts and conditions on the ground. And I want to do that by looking at three pieces of research, which are also the readings that I asked everybody to do for this week. So let's go right into the readings. And the first of them that I want to look at is by Florian Bieber. There's Florian. On the administrative creation of identities. What Florian Bieber is looking at in his study is censuses in Southeast Europe and the way that censuses are created and imposed, partly successfully and partly unsuccessfully, by the offering of different national categories of identification and by censuses encouraging and discouraging certain forms of identification. So the basic premise here is Weber regards the national state as being organized by ethnic entrepreneurs. And ethnic entrepreneurs, when they're in power, engage in the work of creating and promoting certain ethno-national identities. One of the ways that they do this is through a census, demonstrating that members of one group or another are present or are in the majority on a particular territory. But we can raise some questions about the statistics produced by the census. The statistics are presented as describing an objective reality, something external to the census. But is it possible that the reality that is described by the census is a product of the kind of measurement that is done in the census? Because there is something we know. One thing we know is that ethnic categories come in and out of use. New ones are invented, old ones fall out of use, they change. Standards of measurement change. We're able to see this in the Yugoslav census, for example, where in the earliest censuses after the Second World War, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, people who would later be identified as Muslims were identified as Yugoslav. Later, they were asked to choose whether they identified more as Serb or Croat. In the 1960s, the category of Muslim was introduced into the census, and this was Muslim in the national sense, not in the religious sense. In the 1974 Constitution, Muslims were established as a nation. The term Muslim as a descriptor of a national group is no longer in use in the countries Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia in particular, where they were used. The term that has been used is one that's been pulled out of earlier history, Bosniak. So new categories emerge, old categories disappear, and these categories, the use of them has political force, because what census results and declarations of national identity are used for is as a form of politics. They are used to justify claims for the control of a particular territory. They are used to justify policies of inclusion and exclusion and so on, so that on the ground, the situation does not look the way that it is described by the census. Instead, Bieber argues, national identities are more ambiguous, boundary lines are more fluid than the neat list of categories that we see on a census suggests, and we're able to see this in instances where people resist census classifications, where they decide to identify themselves as citizens, to identify themselves by place of living, to identify themselves by profession, to invent some fictional, sometimes humorous identities as ways of contesting the categories that are imposed. So we need to make a distinction between private and public choices, and once we start looking at private choices, then the whole question of national identity looks a lot more complex than statistics make them to appear. And we can talk about this also in relation to categories experienced by the same people that tend to come into conflict with one another. This is the condition that's described by Adriana Zacharievich, and she is talking in particular about feminists in the former Yugoslavia, but her argument proceeds from a basic fact, from two basic facts really. One of them, the first of them, is that citizenship is a proposition about belonging, or rather a proposition suggesting that there is a tie between somebody's legal status and somebody's political belonging. Um, Identity is something else. Identity is a proposition about the factors that bind people together, and any human being is going to have more than one identity. If somebody asks you who you are, your answer might be a nationality. Your answer might be a gender. It might be an age group. It might be a family role. It might be a place of living. It might be a profession. We are all of these things at the same time, and which ones come to the fore are going to be determined by conditions that tend to encourage one or another. Now, if you want to talk about women as a politically defined group, during the time that Yugoslavia existed, in the feminist movement, that is, politically organized women, uh, this was an organized group which sought to lobby for improvement of a position within a system. Uh, when Yugoslavia came apart and national states were established, new principles of identity and new principles of loyalty were proposed, which came into conflict for feminists with many of the principles of loyalty and many of the principles of identity that came with gender. So feminist political engagement in the nationalist environment very often meant rejecting the categories that were imposed by nationality, rejecting the ethnic foundation of citizenship and proposing different foundations, foundations based on gender, foundations based on values, so that this conflict raises the question. I mean, first of all, it raises the question of political engagement. Is political engagement a form of participation in citizenship, or is it a form of interrogation of the terms of citizenship? The second point that it raises is that new principles of solidarity in a state, new political regimes, impose new gender regimes, and these restructure the basis of loyalty or disloyalty to the state, so that eventually the relation between citizenship as a form of national belonging and other forms of belonging that people have to their social environment becomes problematized. What I think is important for us here is that every person has the option of choosing nationality as a foundation for identification, assuming that they do identify with a national group, which not everyone does, but they have other options as well, um, other forms of identification that they can choose, and sometimes they do. Sometimes um, sometimes the demands imposed by national belonging come into conflict with other demands that are more important. This question is approached ethnographically in the research by Azar Hromadjic. Now, Azar Hromadjic is an anthropologist who is interested in everyday life and the way that people from different groups mix with and communicate with one another on an everyday foundation. She did her research in the high school in Mostar. The main high school in Mostar is a single building in which students mostly of Bosniak and Croat nationality study in the same building, but in different classrooms. And the territorial spaces of the building are marked. They're marked by tape on the floor so that students from the two groups are kept separate from one another during times of instruction. And there are other ways in which this separation is enforced. One place in which they are not enforced is in the building's bathroom, which is segregated neither by nationality nor by gender. And this became the place where the high school students would hang out, in particular, if they wanted to spend time with and break the boundaries between members of the two national groups. So this was a social place, and it was a place where people engaged in conversation, flirting, and so on. And so she spent a lot of time in the bathroom with these students, talking to them and talking to them in other places. This sounds odd and maybe a little bit amusing, but it reflects a basic insight. That is that everyday communication and relationships, the places where people come into contact with one another, are spaces in which lived identities come into collision with identities that are imposed by ideological and bureaucratic structures. So the institution tells the Croats and the Bosniaks that they should not be together, and it enforces this division. People find ways of getting around to the division, and when they get around it, this practice brings both satisfaction and discomfort. It raises questions for the students. Who do they feel like they're able to talk to? Who do they feel like they're able to have other relationships that might go beyond the superficially social with? And so this practice of mixing becomes very problematic. It's a practice that violates the impermeability of boundaries between ethnic categories, and at the same time has limits that recognize their existence and reaffirms them at the same time. So what we find in Azra Hromagic's research is that um, the desire to be connected to other people, including people from other groups, comes into conflict with a whole set of practices, legal practices and cultural and social practices that tend to enforce these boundaries, but the tension between these is lived by people with a great deal of stress. Sometimes the stress is dismissed as pleasure. Now, what does this all add up to if we want to take the insights from this type of research, different approaches to identity, different approaches to everyday life, and apply it back to areas of nationalism? Well, Ernst Renan, in talking about the nation, talks about the nation as being a daily plebiscite. Every day, people either will or will not perform the activities and participate in the rituals that affirm them being a part of a nation. Michael Billig, another theorist of nationalism, talks about national identities as being confirmed and reinforced or rejected by gestures, sometimes small gestures. The basic weakness of nationalism is that national identities compete with other identities and with other loyalties that people might have. And although it doesn't always seem that way, in this test, in these practices through which national identities are tested every day, national identity doesn't always pass the test. It is not guaranteed to win in the competition, and so the performance and reproduction of national identity is always fraught, regardless of how solid these identities look when they're presented in the form of statistics saying there is a majority of people from this group and a minority of people from this other group in this particular place. And this calls the foundation, the basic assumption behind nationalism, the idea that people have national identities, into question. What do we do with these questions? I hope to talk a little bit about that in the next segment.